Hi everyone, welcome to the Wandering DMs live stream. I'm Paul.
And I'm Dan, and today we're going to be talking about convention games versus campaign games and the ways that they might be similar and the ways that they're different and things you have to worry about in the different contexts. So, Paul, this is a pretty well-timed topic, I think, because you and I are getting ready for our annual house convention in about two
Yep.
weeks. And you on your blog recently showed some stuff that you did at TotalCon about a month back and had some kind of interesting comments specifically about the campaign versus convention difference there.
Yeah, it's funny when talking to folks like at work or friends who don't really do gaming. I call early spring convention season. Not to say that there's really a season for conventions, but that's when I seem to have the most of them. TotalCon in February, the House Convention in April, and then I think there was another one. Yeah, I'm already blanking. That's great. But anyway, I tend to go to a lot of conventions in early spring. And then, of course, we both have home campaigns, or have had home campaigns. Right now, the campaign I'm playing in, I'm just the player in, so it's not really my home campaign, I guess, but I've run stuff in the past, and I'm sure we'll run stuff in the future. And you're running for a group regularly, too, right now, right?
I am, and it's kind of which is great because I think that my history's been kind of bipolar on that issue. Is I never went to conventions when I was young or a teenager. I think I was very far away from anywhere that kind of stuff happened. So I think up until 2005, I only ran campaign games and no conventions.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I moved from Boston, where you are, to New York, where I am now, I didn't have that opportunity for about 10 years. And then the only thing I was doing was our house convention games from about '05 to I'd say last year. So now I actually, for the first time ever, I have both actually. So yeah, I do have a campaign that just had its 1 year anniversary last session, as a matter of fact,
Nice.
and kind of following your lead a bit and going to more conventions, which I'm discovering are delightful. And so I have been a little bit bipolar about that and learning how to do both at the same time. I feel like I'm still working at getting better at.
They're definitely very different beasts. So somebody posted on my blog just yesterday, just coincidentally, about convention play. I'd been posting about the props I had built for a particular horror game that I ran. I've run twice now, and will run again at the next convention. Um, yeah, they're really different things. They're both fun in their own right. They're both kind of role playing, but I would say they're as different as say playing D&D from Cyberpunk. Right? They're it's different games. It's a different experience.
I totally agree. It's very, and I think that for me, that's something that wasn't made clear. Like there isn't part of a book anywhere traditionally that says that.
Mm.
And so I think I've definitely, at least for the books that I came from, I stumbled into that issue and I totally wasn't aware of the difference for a distressingly long time. And I totally walked right into that pit.
It's
Uh,
interesting, right? There's not a lot of writing about convention play and how and why it's different, right?
yeah.
Like, even though clearly, like the game itself was invented via convention, right? Like, sort of
Yeah.
the story of Gygax and Arneson meeting at Gen Con.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I
so
think some people would say, Arneson's, ongoing games in the Twin Cities era was then translated to something very different for actual convention play.
mhm.
But not everybody needs to agree with that. Um,
But certainly in the early days of D&D, we found snippets of information about how prevalent convention play was, or especially tournaments, right? When you get into like tournaments, that was a big factor, I think, in the development of the game. But yeah, I feel like it's rarely addressed in the text, right? Definitely
yeah.
the texts always assume you're going to run a home campaign, which is to say, a recurring game with the same players with potentially no foreseen end date in sight.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll say with like one of the traps that I fell into was taking the classic first ever modules like the G series, Studying of the Hill Giant Chief, Tomb of Horrors, and on the cover, them being advertised as this was the tournament game at Gen Con 7, or this was the tournament game at Origins 2. And then me taking that at face value and trying to run those games just out of the box as written and in a 4-hour convention slot, and discovering they are way too big. They're way too big by like a whole order of magnitude. And maybe me being frustrated, maybe the players being a bit frustrated at not even scratching the surface of the content that's there. So in addition to not clarifying the difference in the books, they were releasing these adventures and saying you could use them in either situation, and you kind of couldn't. And it was kind of frustrating to take these enormous adventures and try to run them in a convention situation, is what I finally learned after a couple of years.
So let me go to I feel like we should address the sort of question or topic that was posed in that comment on my blog, which was sort of, well, why go to conventions? Why are they different? What do they give for you? I think a potential naive perception of them is, well, I'm going to play with a bunch of strangers for 4 hours and then never see them again. What's the point? That's not the game as advertised.
That's a really great question, actually. What is your response to that?
My response was, well, first of all, I would separate into what I'm looking for out of a convention as a player versus as a GM.
Yeah.
As a GM, I really enjoy running convention games because it's a very tight constraint to write to. So if I'm writing my own content, knowing I have exactly 4 hours. If my players aren't familiar with the rules, I'm going to have to teach them. That the pacing is really tight. And I need to know, how am I going to get a satisfying, experience out of this? And frankly, that's a whole problem and whole topic in and of itself, of sort of how do you get that arc of a feeling of, you were in the last 30 minutes of the game and it feels like we're reaching some kind of conclusion.
Right.
And then so I like those constraints creatively in creating content, and then I like the opportunity to test them. Right. The nice thing with conventions, I run the same games over and over again, and I'm constantly tuning that experience, practicing, refining. If my goal is eventual publication, which in some cases it is, it's a great way to sort of test out what works and what doesn't.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I enjoy that a lot as GM. That's sort of the creative side there. Also, maybe I put a little more effort than like with a campaign game. I usually want the minimal effort, especially these days. If I have to spend an hour in prep before my weekly campaign game, I'm like, that's too much. I don't want to do that.
Wow. Really? Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's my goal, is to have zero prep. That's my goal.
Let me follow up on that a little bit. So is that did you have like an enormous body of already written stuff for the campaign that just is going to come into play, or?
Yes and no. Okay, so sometimes I write my own stuff. Do I consider that prep for the campaign? You could. But I'm not going to sit down and write a dungeon every week for the game, right? I do it rarely. I do it when I feel inspired to write some kind of content. And so oftentimes I don't even think of that as prep for the campain. Because I also heavily rely on pre-written material. One of my favorite things about running a campaign is sort of taking different inputs, whether it's an adventure I wrote, or a module someone else wrote, or just a neat idea, or a big wilderness map, or whatever, and kind of, I think of myself when I'm running a campaign as like a quilter, right? I'm taking all these scraps, and I'm trying to assemble them into one whole thing that makes sense as a whole and is attractive as a whole. So that's what I enjoy about campaign play.
That's great. I mean, I tend to feel a little. I mean, I confess, I tend to feel a little dirty using outside sources, and I really fight to get away from that. I really fight to get comfortable with using the other products of the other 7 billion people on this planet, which are all creative and stuff like that. And I tend to be a little bit monomaniacal about trying to commit to only my own stuff, and that gets me in trouble.
Yeah.
Frankly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know. I like taking and modifying other people's stuff. Sometimes I'll run an adventure totally as written. Other times I'll be like, I like this map. I'm going to take this map and I'm going to completely restock it. Or, I like this idea, but I think that they didn't do a great job around it. So I'm going to take this nugget of an idea and build an adventure around that.
To cycle back to the question on your blog, it actually strikes me as similar to a question I asked in my academic job. I think like a year ago, I asked somebody else, why go to conferences? Why go to academic conferences? I don't see the point of that. And of course, my discipline, math, tends to be a little bit more single person isolated. But their answer was, well, in order to meet other people that you might want to be able to collaborate and write a paper with that you wouldn't have met otherwise. And so you're getting your face out there. You're developing a larger network of possible colleagues or collaborators. And from the couple of recent conventions I've gone to, I feel like that's very much happening. There's the games happening, but there's also all the socializing around it. And you're meeting people and you're talking, and maybe you're having a social event at the end of the night and making contacts and swapping Facebook links and email and stuff like that with a lot of really interesting, possibly professional people that I wouldn't have had an opportunity to chat with before that. So my overall network of, and actually for both of us, actually here with the Wandering DMs livecast, actually, like a lot of people have been sharing links around that because we met them at a convention.
Yep. I think that's totally true. And that sort of gets into my angle of what do I go for as a player. The first time I ever attend a new convention, anytime I'm going to a new one I've never been to before, I always go as a pure player the first year. I'm not going to run anything. I don't want that because I kind of want to get the lay of the land and figure out what's the vibe of this convention and not have like I have to run a game hanging over my head while I evaluate that. But so let me go to the flip side of what do I want out of a convention when I'm a player. Totally what you're talking about. Like I'm here to meet people, right? I'm here to play with strangers. I know that feels weird, and frankly, half the time it's terrible, right? Like you can certainly play with some really, really unpleasant people that you never want to play another game with. That happens. If I'm like registering blind for a game, never heard of the DM, never been to this place, don't know who else is going, I kind of assume it's 50-50 whether it's going to be any fun. On the other hand,
improv comedy, having watched a lot of improv comedy here in New York in the last couple of years, it's like that. It has an enormous chance of being terrible.
Right. On the other hand, it could be great, right? And I have met some lifelong gaming friends and collaborators through doing that, right? That I am now in constant touch with, and frankly, maybe my home campaign has some people in it that I met through conventions, right? Like that's definitely a thing.
So you might say it's going to a convention is kind of like an adventure. It's kind of scary and it's kind of risky. And sometimes that's where the greatest rewards are, maybe.
Even apart from just individuals of who you're going to meet, I would also say a convention sort of represents the biggest sort of mix and intersection of ideas. Like I might come to a convention and just see a GM do something that I think is really cool and take that home with me and say, oh, that was really interesting. How can I use that? Or play a game I've never played before, right? That's, I think, the best way to discover a new system is to try it at a convention where there's no, stakes of sort of like, well, if this doesn't go well, we're stuck with this for months.
Right. Or things that the players are doing that I haven't seen before. Like even just in your D&D game at TotalCon, there was a player using just classic traditional D&D spells in ways that I had never seen. It was like, that is really clever, and I feel like I should have thought about that. So, in addition to having a very nice campaign experience with people that you know well, having the challenge of having new strange players might bring totally new perspectives to your game, possibly.
Yep. So Exit Sanity has posted that sometimes a group just wastes a whole session shopping and cavorting in town, and I think that's totally true and wonderful and terrible, right? That's in a campaign, in a home campaign, you kind of need those kinds of sessions. You need those downtime sessions where we just sort of don't try to change the world and do amazing crazy things. Instead, we're just sort of talking to each other and preparing ourselves mentally for next week.
I will admit that that hasn't ever happened in one of my games to date, and that actually might be a whole topic on its own.
Interesting.
And I think I've realized recently that I tend to abstract stuff a little bit more than other DMs, and so it's actually possible that in my campaign that might not be a possible thing that ever happens, but. Common in many places, and maybe we should talk about that actually. Another, like how detailed do you go into village interactions, that actually might differ between different DMs.
I guess I could also twist that to say, like, there are cases where I've done a session where the party goes to town to, sell and shop and cavort, and the outcome of the cavort is a whole unexpected adventure that we just whip up on the fly because what? You're doing what? Okay.
Right.
You got drunk and you punched out the wrong guy, and then somebody accidentally lit fire to half the town, and the whole campaign just goes in a wildly different direction because, okay, I guess that happened.
Well, that's great. That's also, you use the damn carousing rules that I don't use.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's wonderful.
I actually had a session like that where it was simply because a player was absent. I think in the previous session, they had gone cavorting. They'd used the carousing tables at the very end of the session, and one player had rolled something really interesting about, like, some kind of interaction with a weird secret cult. Maybe he joins a secret cult, or maybe something. And then the next session, he was absent. He was just sick or away or whatever it was. I can't remember. Couldn't make it. And so I decided to explain that as, I guess that cult abducted him. And then we had a whole adventure that session of try to rescue our friend from this evil cult that I had to invent on the fly. So that was fun.
Well, that's great. Actually, that is actually something I wanted to talk about conventions versus campaigns. Is you go into a convention game and you have a very focused preset starting point, I'd say, probably pre-generated characters, and you can kind of can depend on exactly what player characters are going to be coming into the session. Whereas your campaign game is very dependent on what player's actually going to show up from night to night. And maybe tonight the thief that was important for something didn't show up, or maybe the wizard didn't show up. And so, maybe with campaign play, you need, like, you and the players need to be a little bit more flexible about what's actually possible. Whereas with the convention games, like, here's the PCs, and this adventure is made for these PCs, and they're perfectly, this square peg goes in this square hole perfectly. Is that something sometimes you have problems with in a campaign game that's not part of a convention?
Yeah, I guess. I think it comes back to that sort of, like, how willing am I to just completely go off book and do crazy stuff. Right. With a campaign, there's almost this safety net of, like, it doesn't matter how far I go with this or where it ends, because we're just going to pick up next week.
Right.
Whereas with a convention game, I still like to improvise at a convention game, don't get me wrong. That's fun. But the constraints are there. Like, I have these 4 hours with these people, and we're never going to see each other again. I mean, we will. We'll go hang out at the bar later. But, yeah, this group of characters in this setting is just simply not going to happen again.
Right.
Typically.
What do you think is just essentially harder for the DM? Do you think the convention game is fundamentally harder, or the campaign game?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think that depends heavily on... Well, what do we mean by harder? Just, like, more taxing or more difficult to
Yeah. I mean, you look at the campaign game, and it feels like you've got an entire world that you're trying to run, and the convention game is probably going to be much smaller. So on that basis, it feels like maybe the convention game should be less taxing, less of a struggle for the DM.
And I actually think it's the opposite. I think the convention game is more taxing because the pacing is so much more important, right? That you have exactly these 4 hours to get to this point, or to get to something that feels satisfying that we can look at afterwards and go, oh, that was a lot of fun. Whereas with campaign play, you can sort of, take your time, right? You don't have to worry about resolving everything immediately.
Right. I agree with that, and I think that the campaign game, the convention games are a much greater challenge for the DM, and I'll say that I come away from conventions, and all of a sudden my campaign game's a lot better, actually. Like, I take those lessons, and I take that intensity and, work it, and all of a sudden my campaign game actually becomes a little bit more intense and a little bit better paced because of the lessons that I'm taking from that. So David Heron there is mentioning that the expectations are so incredibly different.
Yep.
And certainly I agree with David there. And and among them, the major difference is, like, in a campaign game, there's more of this, you can end on an ambiguous note. There's more of an expectation that you're going to be exploring possibly in different directions,
Hmm.
possibly only part of a complex. Whereas in a convention game, like you do need some kind of arc and conclusion.
Yep.
And like I think in prior live casts, you and I have said that you've got to have some kind of goal to
Hmm.
focus the players and kind of be able to touch base with are you doing well at this goal or not at the end of the session.
I just
Uh,
yes, I agree with that. You should totally have a goal in
right.
your convention game. I think that helps a huge amount. I think it helps, frankly, with all games. But
And that's one of the lessons that I've
yeah,
right that I
yeah,
tied into my campaign
yeah,
specifically,
yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
And again, that's the trap I had with classic modules is you can come to a campaign game and say, okay, we're going to be exploring, studying the Hill Giant Chief. You're going to go in different directions. You're going to find some crazy stuff. This might take several sessions. And if you do that, if you roll out that exact same starting point at a convention, that actually usually turns into a bad game
hmm.
because it feels like, well, yeah, where are we going? The items I'm getting are not going to improve my character next week.
Yep.
I'm not really building a team.
Yep.
And so I've had to learn to create those goals. And I think even just like at TotalCon last month, we probably saw one or two games where people made that mistake of just take traditional module, just say explore some stuff, and it doesn't make for the best convention game. So you've got to, if you're going to use that, you've got to go in there and add a specific goal for the convention situation.
Hmm. Yep. Let me jump back quickly. Sorry, there's a
Yeah,
lot of good
sorry.
points there. A lot of good things I want to react to. But let me jump back to David's comments about the expectations are different, and you said something about bringing back the energy from the convention.
Yeah,
One thing I notice on the player side, of course, is that they bring a very different energy. In as much as I like to say, they play to the hilt. Right?
yeah,
They know these characters aren't going to live more than 4 hours, and they're willing to take much bigger risks as a result,
yeah.
which is a lot of fun. I think if you can harness it.
Yeah, and we had some really great experiences in the last month based on that. And I would point out with one single interesting exception is that a couple people in places do run these ongoing, campaigns where the games are only played at conventions. And like I've stumbled into that. I've stumbled into that at our house game, and when we played in Bill Webb's game at GaryCon last year, people had recurring characters, and yeah, the play was totally different.
Mm.
They were really trying to play it safe. They were really a lot more cautious than some of these like we're just going to blow up at the end games.
It's interesting. I know there's a friend of mine who runs games at a lot of the conventions I go to, where what he'll do is he'll run over the course of the weekend. He'll run however many games he can cram in, 6, 8, 12, whatever fits the time frame. But many sessions of one continuous quasi mini campaign,
Yeah, yeah,
right? And then he leaves it up to the players to sort of self decide if they're just going to drop into one or if they're just going to spend their whole convention with him, which he has some players who do this, spend their whole convention with him and play the whole campaign. Um, Now that's interesting. I think also to compare to what we usually do around my birthday, right? Where I invite you and a couple other friends up to my house, and we play for a weekend of just a blitz of one mini campaign, right? One
yeah.
extended. You once ran the Giants for us, right? And we did as much of the Giants as we could.
Specifically the Fire
The
Giant
Fire
game.
Giants, yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
So that's interesting because I really enjoyed that. That's a ton of fun.
yeah,
To go back to this, I've also dropped in on my other friends' games, and I've played in 1 out of 7 or so, right? And I'm playing like the middle one, right? And I have to say, as a player, I was like, this is okay, but
yeah.
this isn't the best game I've ever played. Probably because I've missed the beginning and the end, right? The GM got to see all that, and the players who were all in got to see all that. But was I there for the most exciting of the 6 sessions? I guess not, right? I may have just lucked out of not being at one of the climactic sessions.
I can totally see that because from the DM's angle, it's kind of efficient that I'm going to sit down and I'm going to write one single thing, and that turns into 4 sessions that I've filled up. But it takes away the focus of I've got to make an interesting arc and climax per session.
Yeah.
So if he's made an interesting climax in the last game, it's easy to take your eye off the ball and forget about making an interesting arc in each session. So I can totally see that.
I don't know if that's really what's happening, right? I have not a ton of data points. I played in one of those games once, but
Yeah.
the and I think you would still be conscious of those sort of codas because like your table gets up and leaves, right? And then they come back and reform, so, and you have some amount of time in between. So I gotta assume you're like, whoa, oh, there's a clear break here.
Unless you've got a dedicated room to your games the whole time, which happens in some places.
That's true. That's true.
Not common, but sometimes. Yeah.
So my favorite kind of game recently to run at conventions has been horror. I've been running a lot of them, and one of the things I like about that is that the arc is built into the setup and mechanics, irrespective of the content. The arc specifically of what I'm looking for out of a horror game, because I can't even imagine, honestly, playing a campaign, like a Cthulhu campaign. I know some people do it. I don't understand how it works. Because when I sit down to play Cthulhu, I expect that in fairly short order, my character is going to become useless, in as much as either he's completely insane or dead. And I like that. I enjoy that. I enjoy that setup of sort of, I'm role-playing a character who's fairly normal in the setting, right? And they're going to encounter extraordinary things, and my goal is to see how they react to that. Either do they step up to the challenge and behave heroically, and thus probably die horribly, or do they succumb to the challenges and lose their mind and fall into madness?
Let me just riff on that. That's great. Maybe what you need is a campaign that's so two possibilities here. Maybe you need a campaign that's a mashup between Cthulhu and Paranoia, whereby you have a group of clones where the next clone gets run out every session after having been horribly torn apart.
Right.
Or something. I don't know if you've seen the movie Endless. Any chance you've seen Endless?
No, I haven't.
It's like this indie kind of Lovecraftian flavored movie that I liked a lot recently, actually, in which there's some kind of timey-wimey thing whereby you keep getting rebooted between sessions. Anyway, just kind of free associating there.
No, that's great. That's great. So that would be interesting. I think that would be an interesting challenge for me to figure out how the heck to adapt horror to a campaign. But my point being, though, that like I really enjoy running them in conventions because, again, I think they fit perfectly in the setting. I've been writing content that is a little more sandboxy because I kind of don't care how much the players get through it. They invent their own arcs of drama through it by their characters discovering terrible things and them reacting to that badly.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I noticed at HelgaCon coming up, you're actually not running any D&D, right?
It's true. That's a bit of an accident, but that's what happened.
So what proportion of games are horror there that are you doing?
Actually, that's hard to say. Okay.
Right.
Just one, really. But two of the other games I'm running also have elements of horror in them. I will be bringing the insanity cards to at least one of those other games. That's not their goal. They're not overarchingly, meant to be this game. Not like my Cthulhu games, where it's like, I'm very direct with my players at those games. I sit down at the table and I say, my goal as GM in this game is to make sure that each of you is either insane or dead by the end. I just lay that out on the table, so just want to set the tone. I never succeed at that. I've yet to completely get each and every one of them completely insane and dead, but that's my goal.
Great. And just in case anybody, so Paul just mentioned the insanity cards, which is his mechanic for running insanity in any kind of game, actually, horror, D&D, whatever. I've got it listed in the OED rules as the preferred mechanic for insanity, and that is available on Game Crafters. If you go to gamecrafters.com and look for insanity cards, it's a great product, and everybody that ever plays with it gets a copy.
Thanks for the plug.
It's all true. It's all totally true.
I really enjoy using them. So the funny thing is, one of the games I'm running at this upcoming convention is Warhammer Fantasy RPG, the latest 4th edition that came out, in which they removed their insanity rules. And I was like, great. I guess I know what I'm doing.
That's great. Let me ask about like how much content fits into a 4-hour convention slot. So
Hmm.
again, I've been struggling, I think, getting better at taking classic modules and going, oh, you can't do that in 4 hours. That's ridiculous.
Right. That's.
Um,
I'm
it-
sorry. Go on.
go ahead.
Oh, just okay. So we're gonna completely set horror to the side now because fitting D&D into a convention or any like just sort of standard fantasy is a really interesting and thorny problem to solve, I think.
Right.
And what I've come to the conclusion is, like, I still want some of those moments of improv in those games, but I also very much believe that you have to have a good quantity of content more than what you think that the players could get through,
Okay.
right?
Okay.
Because otherwise it will feel very railroady, right? If you have exactly the number of rooms that they can get through,
Yeah.
then they're gonna get through those rooms and have seen everything and feel like that they never had any choices to make.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's interesting. And so that so like I guess sub question part A was, yeah, do you make like a branching dungeon with a whole lot of possible different directions, or do you make a linear dungeon where you're definitely going to go A B C D E F in a particular order? So it sounds like you're recommending the branching
Yeah, well, because
that
I'll
you
give
can
you I'll
possibly
give you the
explore.
perfect example of the previous, which is the A series. If you go through the A series of modules and you play them with the tournament filter on, and you play just the
Yeah.
tournament stuff, it is very much a linear progression, right? There is zero
Right.
choice for the players. They go from room A to B to C to D.
Right.
And my experience having running those is that while they're fun, there's interesting rooms to encounter that they're not nearly as fun as the games where the players feel like they have more freeform choice to influence their destinies.
Well, that's a really interesting observation. So I think that you have more experience with that than I do. And like the number of examples that I've seen about tournament stuff, like A series, like when we played in the D&D tournament at Gen Con, like '04 or something like that.
Hmm.
I feel like the tournament we were in at GaryCon last time were like they're all railroady, they're all
Yep,
linear. And so
agree.
I get the impression that I would get the impression just from that tournaments are by default always made linear.
I think that's true, and I think that's because it's easier.
Yeah.
Not that it's better. It's definitely not better. I think it's just easier to
Right.
write that way. Um,
Okay. Interesting. Okay. So interesting. So you're pretty committed to having more spaces and more
yeah,
content than any particular group can ever get
yeah.
to.
The contrasting point I would give is if you look on my blog fairly recently, I posted the adventure I ran at TotalCon called Gloomwood Falls. This is
Hmm.
a one page dungeon that I lifted out of my campaign from many years ago and have run time and time again at conventions. So it's well tested, well played, and been tuned a lot. Um, it's got a lot of different areas. I've never played it. I've never seen any group see everything. In fact, the last time I ran it, there's a whole little section of like 4 or 5 rooms where there's a lich, and
Yeah.
having run this now at least half a dozen times at different conventions, the last run is the first time I've had a group actually encounter the lich. But
With
that
very
group,
interesting consequences.
yeah, and
Yeah.
but on the other hand, that group didn't encounter the purple worm, which is often one of the most successful encounters in that thing. People always
Okay.
often come away from that game going, "Oh, the purple worm encounter was great."
Okay.
Yep, I
And that's
agree.
the one where like you have like one end in one room and one end in another room. Is
Yeah,
that what
yeah.
I'm thinking of?
The
Yeah.
purple worm is so massive it literally fills some of the passageways that connect rooms, and so yeah, you end up kind of fighting both ends of the worm.
Great. Great. Um, so that having been said, so granted that you like to see a branching series of possibilities, one question that I might ask, whether you're making a linear game or a multi-branching game, is how many encounters do you expect the players to run into in
Hmm.
4 hours? And that could either be, well, that's just the entirety of my linear game, or that could be like, how big do I need to make the different branches, maybe?
Yeah. It's a tough question because the more time you have, the fuzzier I think the number gets. If we look
Yeah,
at, say, my boss fight for breakfast games, which are
yeah,
pretty linear, um, I have 2 hours. I can tell
yeah,
you exactly like 3 to 5 rooms is what 3 to 5
yeah,
3 to 5 rooms is what I want. And really, I try to tie all those rooms together into one crazy big encounter, right? Like
right.
one sort of it's really though it's kind of 3 encounters. Really, often it's usually the complexity level of 3 encounters is usually what I'm going for in boss fight.
Okay, in 2 hours. Now that unlike many of our games, it's battle map, it's miniatures, it's an all-round action sequence.
Admittedly,
so
I haven't always run it that way. I have run it
Yeah.
without miniatures and then more free flowing, just sort of showing handout drawings and asking where are you.
Okay. All right. Okay.
So
Okay.
yeah,
Interesting.
I've done it the other way as well, which works.
Okay. Interesting.
Um,
So I think in the games that I've been a player recently, I don't know if you've noticed, if you're ever a player sitting next to me, I'm keeping a tally count on my paper of how many encounters or rooms we get to actually to keep statistics on that. And I think in the games that we tend to play in, I tend to find about a dozen these days in 4 hours. So it tends to be about I tend to be seeing around 3 encounters per hour is what I'm seeing in the kind of loosish D&D or DCC games.
David asked an excellent question, which I think we should both try to answer. When he asks, "What do you mean by the complexity level of 3 encounters?" You're saying a dozen encounters, and I want to ask you, well, what is the complexity level of those encounters? So let me give you a range. A low complexity encounter is you fight 6 goblins, right? I think we all know how to run that encounter. That's pretty straightforward. On the other hand, I've had a boss fight for breakfast game. In the end room, the room is bowl-shaped, in the center of which is a huge pool. Living in the pool is a giant with the head of a hippopotamus who's surrounded by an anti-magic field. He has some cultists around him that worship him. There are also, additionally, some were-tigers in the room that you have to contend with. The room has multiple physical features that make it interesting and unusual to deal with. Steps in one place and stuff hanging from the ceiling and a trapdoor, etc. So that I would consider a high complexity encounter. But high complexity meaning the number of different enemies and the number of different sort of physical features of the room itself.
Right. That's definitely the high end. And for me, like usually I'm counting like number 1, we fought 6 goblins. Number 2, we had a negotiation with the boss of the Thieves Guild. Number 3, we were searching a room carefully for traps to make sure we didn't blow up. 4, we tried to fight the champion boxer or something like that. And so it's interesting because right before this live cast, I looked up the old TSR product. It's marked Module C6. I think the title is the Official RPGA Tournament Handbook.
We have an image for our
yeah, there you go. There it is. Thank you very much. Right there. It's 1987, right? 1987 is what that is. And so, that has a couple of adventures actually, and then it's got a half dozen page section at the end of the existing RPGA recommendations for tournaments for 4-hour convention slots. And they have a bunch of different, encounter types. They have like a dozen encounter types. So it's a combat, or it's a guard dog, or it's a trap, or it's a negotiation, or something like that. And their recommendation in 4 hours is 6 to 8 encounters. It says 6 to 8 encounters in 4 hours, counting combat as 1.5 encounters.
That's interesting. And
then also having between 0 and 3 uneventful encounters. So I'm not entirely sure. Frankly, I can't figure out what an uneventful encounter would be.
Right. Well, let me ask you this, because we've been throwing around number of rooms versus number of encounters. Do you have like empty mood only rooms? Assuming it's like a standard dungeon crawl.
I wouldn't count those as an encounter.
Right. Me either. I suspect my gut tells me that's what they're talking about. Here's a room with some stuff in it that is evocative of the setting, but there's nothing for you to do. Move on.
That's fair, and that probably lines up. Like, actually, if you look at the A series stats, actually they're very consistent. Is that they have 12 rooms. They have 9 of those rooms with something significant to slow you down, and it's of those 9, it's 5 monsters and 4 traps. So that actually lines up pretty well. You have 9 actual content rooms, and you have 3 basically empty rooms for a total of 12 rooms, and that happens in both halves of A1 part A, A1 part B, et cetera, like both halves of each module. So you're probably right. That's probably what they're thinking about. Now, here's a quiz question. So
Yeah.
granted, the RPGA recommendation is 6 to 8 actual encounters, let's say in 4 hours. They have a maximum page count size, right? We recommend that you don't go over this many pages in your manuscript. And Paul, I would like you to guess what the upper bound is for. Now it's double spaced for what it's worth, but how many pages is the most that they would accept for 6 to 8 encounters?
It's gonna be higher than I'm comfortable with, so let me buffer that. I'm gonna say 20.
45 pages. 45. They think they're gonna hand a tournament session to somebody, and it's 45 pages, and you're gonna be able to parse that content and run it competently on the spot. Can you believe that?
Jeez.
Yeah.
Oh
yeah.
man. How many do you want, Dan? What's Dan's recommendation?
6. I think I want 6.
Okay.
Frankly.
Okay.
Like 10 starts to become ridiculous. It depends on how dense the text is, but frankly, you know, I want like 6 digest-sized pages. Frankly, is what I want. Now it's interesting because so we know people.
Can I just be even crazier and say like I want 2 or 3?
Great, I respect that. Yeah, yeah, and now you know what? 2 years ago, I would have pushed back against that. Honestly, I would have said no, too little. And now, partly because of my campaign game, I see the more text, the more it slows down the pacing, and the harder it is for the DM to be flexible about it. So now I'm going to respect that and say, that might be quite legitimate.
Yeah, if I could get away with 1, that's my absolute favorite, and that's if you look at Gloomwood Falls, that's what it is, 1 page.
One starts
hard.
to grind me a bit, difficult. But I see why that's useful. It works.
Yeah,
it works. Yeah.
So I'll give you an extra 2 or 3 pages.
So you and I both know people that widely vary on that. How much content do I prepare? And so our very good friend BJ obviously is probably my example of like high end of extravagant spectacle at a convention, and he makes custom miniatures and he makes custom terrain and elaborate plots, and he probably takes several months to put all that together for even one game. And then you and I might like 6 to 8 pages. I saw Mike Curtis at TotalCon run a game with 2 pages of just handwritten notes, and then we also know some old school people like I guess Tim Kask and Frank Metzer who just improvise the entire thing, and they come in with 0 pages and say to players, each player give me 2 words, and I'm going to construct an adventure entirely on the fly, entirely improvised.
That is what they've been running recently. Yep.
Yeah, yeah. The vast difference in protocols for what some people do.
Here's the funny thing. For written material, actually, I feel like I want a little more for conventions, or at least not just a little more, but a little more refinement, a little more practice. I mean, certainly I go way off the deep end in building props for my horror games, so I put a lot of effort into that. Whereas, when I talk about my campaign games, my goal really is 0 prep. I want as little as I can possibly get away with. Yeah.
Wow.
Just because I feel like it's a different thing, right? What I've said is I think like when I get into like long-term campaign where just we don't know where this is going to go, we're just going to play until we're so sick of it we don't want to play anymore. I want to come to the table feeling like I'm playing too, right?
Okay.
So I want to feel like not like at a convention game. I guess I feel a little bit more like I'm performing.
Yeah.
Whereas at a home campaign, I feel like I'm just another player with a slightly different role.
I might have to process that actually. That's one I might have to process a bit actually. I definitely feel like I'm performing as the campaign DM, and I like that. And I'm kind of a failed actor a little bit, and I'm looking for stage time.
I mean, there's definitely a performative aspect to role playing, no matter how you take it, right? Even if when I'm showing up as the player, I'm kind of performing to the rest of the group, right? Like, so it's never 0 performance.
True, true. I mean, you're right, but yeah.
Okay, well there you have it.
It's certainly a more intense
Yeah.
certainly more intense interaction when you're DM and you're managing a table full of players and the rules and the monsters and the scenario behind the scenes. And so there's certainly more stuff happening in my head when I'm DM than when I'm player.
Yeah, no, for
Uh,
sure, for sure. But again, like my favorite sessions, the ones that stand out to me the most are those ones like the one I described where my players spent a whole session trying to free their friend from the cult that had abducted him. And I literally had nothing. I had to I was like, let me dig through some maps and see if I have a map that looks vaguely like a cult headquarters. What's going on with this weird cult? They had one clue, which I had dropped the previous session without thinking about it, in that he was last seen with a man in a purple turban. And
yeah.
thus we introduced the Silk Guild to our game, which was wonderful.
That really sounds like an amazing game, Paul. That really does. I mean, I tip my hat to you for being able to pull off something so seemingly elaborate, entirely improvised.
And
Because if I was going into that kind of situation, I would really be sweating bullets and be very unhappy, frankly. That sounds amazing.
I mean, don't get me wrong, I was sweating bullets, and this is, and what I'm talking about here is the ideal, a thing that happened once over the course of a 2-year campaign,
Yeah.
right? I mean, no, I may probably, hopefully, if I think about it, we had some lesser versions of that. Probably some of my players will point out the crazy vampire hunt they went on. Yeah, when those things happen, those are my favorite moments, and I want to do whatever I can to promote them happening more frequently.
My tradition is that I over prepare and that I'm a little Aspergersy and I am trying to get more and more flexible about less prep. And the lessons that I've had lately about the outdoor spoliation game and the convention games is I'm certainly fighting in a direction of less prep. I think I probably over prepare is probably what I do.
You know, here's a funny anecdote for you. When I was in college, we had a friend who was GMing who was very good at improvising stuff on the fly, and yet
Yeah.
was also prone to over prepare.
Yeah.
So he would write and write and write content, and we as players delighted in overturning that apple cart. Like, he would present a huge amount of stuff, and we would look for a way to go the other direction. Oh, that's great. You invented all this stuff, but we're going to go over here instead. It probably drove him nuts.
That's delightfully sinister.
Yeah. I mean, maybe
I really appreciate that.
as young college students, maybe we were a little more free to be that mean-spirited. But it's funny. I don't know. Does he still over-prepare? Probably. But does he recognize that that he has a skill there that we were trying to help him discover?
Great.
I hope so.
Well put. Well put. So probably as we probably get closer to the end of this discussion, I want to ask again, because you know what, so the convention games that I've run have almost entirely been at our house convention where I know everybody, or close to everybody, or at least secondhand acquaintance for everybody. I think the number of times that I have run a convention game for complete strangers is just once.
Okay.
Well, twice. Okay. So only two times have I run convention games with complete strangers. For you, then that number is what?
I don't know. A lot.
More than 10, more than 20, more than 50?
Probably more than 10 to 20, maybe, if I had to make a guess. I don't know.
So one question that possibly comes up is so granted that you've got total strangers coming to the table, what are your techniques for dealing with possibly really problematic or sociopathic players?
Oh, geez.
And I have never had that happen.
Yeah.
I've seen discussions online where people clearly did, and actually in OD&D discussions just 2 days ago, there were at least 2 people coming back from GaryCon the other week, longtime, well-known players that said, I will never run a D&D game in public ever again because it's such a pain in the butt when I get, unrepenting, troubling players. So what are your tactics? Have you seen that, and how do you deal with it?
I've seen it. I've seen it. Usually what I've encountered is not a player who's just so, I don't know, cruel or mean or whatever, just offensive. I've not seen that, right? I've not seen a player where I've just been like, I need you to leave the table because someone's going to throw a punch. Like, I've not seen that. What I have seen are players who are more interested in their own experience, are not paying attention to the rest of the table, have their own ideas of where they think the game should or could go. I once had a player show up with his, I don't know what, 3.5 or 5th or whatever whatever they were playing at that time in the sort of Adventure League-esque kind of game, and was very insistent about wanting to play that. And I'm like, I'm not even running that game. I'm running a BX D&D game. You have to use these pre-generated characters.
Yeah.
Like that's not, and he just couldn't quite get through his head that like it's not that kind of game.
Wow.
The kind of game you're looking for is not that kind of game, and he didn't seem to understand that. And at some point, I think you have to accept that like my duty as GM is to the whole table, to try and get as much fun to the whole table as possible. So if someone is being that disruptive, then give them every opportunity you can to engage with the game at hand. But when that's not working, sort of quickly adjudicate what they're doing in terms of how it impacts the rest of the game and move on.
Yeah.
Maybe that makes that player feel a little ignored or a little sidelined, and I'm sorry if that's the case. But what else can you do?
I
mean, you could. Sense. I suppose in an extreme case, you could really just slam the brakes on and say, "Hey guys, we need to have a discussion as human beings for a moment, not as game players, right? Not as people in this game. That we have a problem to address."
Yeah.
Another thing I'll point out is I think it's super important. Sorry, now I'm riffing a little bit here, but I think it's super important at the beginning of any convention game to set out what it is you're hoping to achieve out of that game. Like I said, in my horror games, right off the bat, I say my goal as GM is this, right? With the boss fight for breakfast games, I'm very like this is this kind of game. It's light. You're gonna kick down the door. You're gonna fight something really nasty. It's gonna be fun and wild, and we're gonna be done in 2 hours.
I'm writing that down actually.
I think establish expectations.
That might be something that I actually overlook, right? So having not run convention games for strangers a lot, this set expectations quickly at the start might be something I actually totally overlook and just assume that we all have shared understandings of what the experience is going to be. And I might be wrong about that. And what you just said is very similar to what I thought the best response was on this discussion board yesterday of someone saying, I come in, it's going to be D&D, and just 5 seconds say, here's the expectations. You work as a team, and you as a player come up with a reason to work as a team on this quest.
Yep.
And then goes on from there. And if someone violates that or is uncomfortable or tries to run off on their own, forgive them once, ping them once very briefly, and then ask them to leave if that doesn't fix it from then.
Yeah. I mean, it's like I think I posted somewhere at some point congratulating. I was listening to an actual play game of this horror game that I've been running recently, where one player was a criminal who had a chance to escape halfway through the game, and I think the player kind of realized well, I could do it. I could run away and escape and never see these jerks again. But then I'm not really playing this game anymore.
Yeah.
Right. And so that player actually invented a reason to come back. It's like, oh, well, my beloved Tommy gun is still in the inspector's trunk, and I need to go get it back. So I'm going to sneak over there and save it.
See, that's high-level play, right?
Yeah,
that's high-level play, and it adds to everybody at the table, and that's the kind of player that you want at your table. And I can see why you were so enthusiastic about that particular game, actually.
I thought that was brilliant. I love players to do that. I guess I've never directly asked my players, please do this, but I have... I do delight in the motivations table. Like when a player says, "Well, why am I going into this dungeon?" Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Let me roll on this table. It turns out your parents have been abducted, and you need to discover the lost star of Umam Gamash, which is alleged to be hidden down here, to use as ransom to get them back.
That's really quite amazing. That's an amazing table, I must admit. That's an amazing table and amazing usage of it.
It's fun.
Yeah,
it's a lot of fun. Yeah, so I love that. Yeah, if they need a goal, give it to them. But make it clear that I don't know, we're here to play this game, right? The point is to play this game. So please play.
Yeah. So if that happens for me, maybe the ways that I can improve it is do that brief expectation setting that we want to work together in this game. Definitely give people a goal. and not just think you can run an exploration like you do in a campaign game. And yeah, and try to be aware of what's happening for every player at the table. That hopefully something interesting is happening for everybody.
Yeah, I think that's this the stickiest point for me of dealing the problem player question is like realizing that I have a responsibility to 6, 8 people here, and as much as I feel for this person and I would love to take them aside and have a direct heart to heart, okay, let's talk about this. You're having issues with this game, or
Right.
you're not understanding. Like
Right.
now I'm boring 5 other people. Now I'm making
Right.
their con experience terrible. So.
Right.
I,
And I was, you know what, this is the same thing that I deal with in class actually, is I have 30 people in class, and if one person's really having a hard time or really upset, unfortunately I have to be aware of like how much profit is this for the one person versus the other 29 people in that
Yep.
situation. And so I do wind up, being just a little bipolar, but I do have to have a little bit of an authoritarian personality in class. But if someone shows up one-on-one in my office, I have a very different, probably softer
Yeah.
personality in that situation. And so it's interesting. No matter what you try to do, there's this fuzzy boundary of there are people involved, and you might actually have to have that kind of out of game discussion possibly someday. But time prioritized, and maybe the 4 hours of the convention is not the time for that.
Yep. Yep.
Yeah,
Excellent.
interesting. Awesome. Okay, well, that's pretty much the main things that I could think of. Is there anything else you wanted to add to that today, Paul?
No, I think that's it. I think we covered quite a lot of ground there. So
You did.
Yeah.
And I think I learned some stuff. So thank you for your greater experience on that.
It's funny. You really threw me for a loop with the question of how many times have I played with unknown players, because of course one of the joys of conventions is they don't stay unknown for very long.
Great point.
So.
Great point. Yeah.
So I encourage folks, go out, check one out, go explore, go for a day, right? Like if you can find a local one that's easy to get to, just get the day pass for the most popular day and see what it's like. Take some chances. Expect that half of them are going to be terrible, and then be happy with the good ones. And I guess also I would say, like in that sort of networking, you're going to meet people. Write down people's names. Next time you go next year, maybe instead of looking for your favorite system, look for your favorite GM.
Yeah, totally. And for some of us have personalities that aren't 100%, perfectly compatible with, like, I go out and meet a whole lot of people and that's great at bars and stuff like that. And, it can feel a little risky, and it is. And I couldn't recommend more the wonderful experiences and how incredibly much more energy I've had coming away from the conventions that I've been at with good and bad experiences. It has, improved my role playing so incredibly much, and it's improved my life so incredibly much. And I tend not to be the most social person in the world, and boy, it's improved me in a lot of ways, actually.
Awesome. Yeah, I think at conventions there's, yes, you can have this awkward feeling of like I'm around a whole bunch of strangers and, here I am at the party where I don't know anyone and I'm not sure what to say or do. But like you can go and talk to any of those people about D&D and
yeah, good point. There's your icebreaker right there,
Yeah,
right?
Yep.
And you know what? Like I said before, it's an adventure. Yeah.
Totally
It's
is.
risky. It's the possibility of huge rewards. It might be a total disaster once in a while, and that's what you want.
Yep.
That's an adventure, and that's what you want.
That's great point to end on. Excellent. Do you have anything else to add, Dan?
That's all I got.
Okay, great. So please leave us some comments in the comment section here. Tell us good, bad, indifferent convention experiences you've had, how to deal with the problem player, any thoughts on campaign play versus convention play, and we'd love to hear it, and maybe that'll spin off a new conversation for us in a future livecast.
Yeah, and as always, please subscribe if you haven't to our Wandering DMs channel on YouTube. That helps us out a lot. In 1 week, I'm going to have another Dan in Peru video where I will be making a random DM ruling about something I saw in Peru a little while ago. And then in 2 weeks, we do have our house convention HelgaCon happening. Do I have that calendar right, Paul?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we're still kind of working out what we're going to do that weekend. We might possibly do a couple snippets between games like we did at Total Con, or we'll try to figure out something we'll do on that Sunday in 2 weeks. So please come back in 1 week and then in 2 weeks to join us for whatever we're doing at that time. And we'll talk to you then.
See you then.